Oscar Niemeyer, one of the most influential architects of the last century, has died at the age of 104. He was responsible for the revolutionary design of Brazil's capital, Brasilia, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as well as the design of the UN building in New York. His inventive, curved designs left their mark on cities across the world. They called him the concrete poet, and you can see why. Oscar Niemeyer said he was inspired by the curves of a woman's body and the shapes he observed in nature in his native Brazil. He worked closely with structural engineers to push his designs to the very limit, creating rippling curves in reinforced concrete. Though he was also called tomorrow's traditionalist, even some of his earliest buildings still look futuristic today.
I have my style. I do things the way I like. I'm not interested in what others have to say.
Oscar's cardiograph is what they nicknamed the sweeping Niemeyer facade.
Some of Niemeyer's most recognizable buildings formed Brasilia, the visionary new capital city that was constructed from scratch in 4 years in the 1950s, and which, though he later recognized its flaws, Niemeyer described as like a miracle, which showed the world what Brazil could do. He was a lifelong Marxist, but one of Niemeyer's most famous buildings is the stunning crown-shaped cathedral in Brasilia. Its concrete spires and glass roof admired by over 1 million visitors every year. Niemeyer was influenced by Le Corbusier, the giant of modern architecture. They worked together in Rio in the 1930s and collaborated again on the UN Secretariat building in New York in 1952. In an architectural career spanning decades, Oscar Niemeyer built over 500 buildings, including the Sambadrome in his home city of Rio de Janeiro. After remarrying at the age of 99, following the death of his first wife, he carried on working past his 100th birthday, espousing the power of architecture right to the very end.
You've never seen architecture like this. A cathedral like this. You've seen more beautiful ones, but never like this. You've never seen a Congress building like this. Now that's architecture.
Well, we're joined now by Julia Paton-Jones, the co-director of the Serpentine Gallery in London, which was designed by Oscar Niemeyer, and indeed she saw Niemeyer as recently as March, and by the former president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Sunand Prasad. Sunand, let's just start with Brasilia, because it's the biggest, most brutal thing he built, and it was a total disaster for 40 years.
It was a disaster for a while. Now, of course, it's a World Heritage Site, the only 20th century site to be designated a World Heritage Site.
He had to rip up the wilderness to get there, and that's a rather sort of un-Brazilian thing now.
Yes, it was he and Louis Costa, his teacher, actually, who was the planner for Brasilia, and they found a most beautiful climate and made this extraordinary monumental building, which, however, a set of buildings, which, however, weren't strictly functionalist. That was what he did that was different from before. He was very interested in the impact of those shapes.
I'll come to the Serpentine in a moment, but you saw him this year. I'm
as a result of our incredible experience of working with him, I became a regular visitor to Brazil, to Rio, and to his studio, and it was really one of the seminal experiences of my life. And I suppose that one of the things that is so marvelous and was so distinctive about him was this was a man who operated in a studio. It was one room. There were no desks, there were no computers. He had a secretary, one of 2 assistants, and that was really it. There was a room where he did his drawings, as you saw on the screen just here. And then you went into this tiny little inner sanctum, which was his library with his books around him, with his photographs, but a really, really tiny, tiny room. And that was the receiving room. And just outside it was his where he did his drawings. So the whole thing was incredibly modest. And I think that goes so against the kind of ethos of today. It was all about the handmade.
Well, let's just sort of put him into historical context, because basically he spanned Le Corbusier right up to Zaha Hadid. He was influenced by Le Corbusier, and he influenced deeply Zaha Hadid, who, of course, designed key building in the Olympic complex.
I think of him as somebody who opened paths, new ways of looking and thinking beyond the international style of Le Corbusier. And there are many, many people. I think, for example, the Dutch school, where they take surfaces which twist and turn and become the insides of buildings. That's his invention, really. And actually, to go to his, you said in your film clip that it was futurist, but I think never has that been truer, because we now see his buildings and recognize current preoccupations that he had actually been engaging with 50, 60 years ago.
Well, let's look at the UN headquarters. Now, I think a lot of people would say it's a skyscraper. And it's the tall, square tombstone of a building. I love it. But on the other hand, is it so revolutionary?
No, I don't think that's the greatest of Niemeyer's works. It's a very compromised building.
More often than
it
most
was
of
actually
his work.
designed by committee to some extent.
All right, let us conjure his cathedral then.
Yes.
Let's have a look at that, the Brasilia Cathedral. Here's a Marxist putting together Jesus Christ's shed. There.
He was. And actually, he said very often, he talked about his religious buildings, because that's not the only one. And he had no difficulty at all, because actually, as a Marxist, he was a believer. He was not a theoretician.
Okay,
he believed in Stalin and Marx.
Let's go to outer space then, and the Niterói Contemporary Art Museum. I mean, this is quite an incredible sort of, gosh, I mean, heavens. That he got to the future of Brazil before Brazil did.
Yes.
What?
Absolutely, and actually directly related to Julia's Serpentine Pavilion. The shapes there, the ramp, the way you get into it.
Okay, let's not eclipse then. That ramp leads to you.
Thank you. Well, it does indeed.
Let's call up your building.
What we asked Oscar to do was to use some of the signature landmarks, the trademarks of his architectural language, and include them in the pavilion he designed for us. Now, he did that he really stuck to the brief, which was so incredible. And there was this momentous occasion when President Lula came to see the pavilion with a translator who spoke no English whatsoever, and they literally stormed the ramp, got into the pavilion itself, and it was a day.
And how old was he then? 99, I think, wasn't he?
Oscar was, I think, when he designed our pavilion, he was 96.
That's old enough.
And he drew it in situ, in the image you saw earlier of him drawing, he drew it on the first day we went to see him.
I've got to leave it there, but what a great guy, and what a privilege to be allowed to talk about it. Thank you both very warmly for coming in.